Hey guys, we are back with Why the Pros Play. In this case, we are going to be looking at Tychus, played by Azerite. Tychus is, he's always been kind of one of those heroes that in the right comps, he's good. But after some of his recent changes, where they've given him things like press the advantage, they've moved quarterback down to level 1, given an extra 20% damage boost, given him things like melting point. We've been seeing a lot more Tychus in the competitive scene, even in some comps where he wasn't optimal. So what an optimal comp for Tychus looks like is a comp that gives him a target that he can safely DPS. What I mean by that is it's usually a tank that can stun a target without having the whole team need to dive in to reach that target. For example, a ETC or a Diablo might charge in, and Tychus would have a hard time following them without using his escape. Something like a Varian or a Garrosh could taunt someone that's a lot closer to Tychus, and he doesn't need to get very far away from his team. And Garrosh could throw a target closer to him, so he could stay a lot closer. His lower range gives him a huge disadvantage in that fact. But the benefit of Tychus is that he is one of the highest DPS when it comes to burst damage to any target in the game. What that means is, if you're going against a tank, Tychus can blow up a tank just as fast as you can blow up an assassin, meaning that you open up the field to being able to DPS and kill just about any target in the game because of how his minigun works. You can activate this, and your basic attacks to heroes do 2.5% of their maximum health every attack. Well, you attack 4 times per second, which means that you do 10% of their health per second with your trait alone. Not to mention the fact that you're going to be hitting them for about 200 DPS with your basic attack. So all in all, you're doing 10% of their health per second plus 200. So it allows you to quickly drop many targets. This gets increased by taking the talent level 4, the bigger they are, increasing the damage bonus to 4%, which means that you do 16% of their health per second until they get down to about 30% health. At 30% health, your minigun stops working, but generally what people will run in this is they will go grenade build so that the first 70% of their health use your trait, and the last 30% you'll use both your minigun as well as your frag grenade. Now, most Tychuses in the meta go a grenade build. This means taking quarterback, taking melting point, and also taking Titan grenade. That allows you to drop any target because of that extra 5% of their health. It allows you to drop any low health target, including tanks. But in this case, they're going to be running Malthael with Last Rites, so he ends up going with a teeny bit of a safer build that is less reliant on securing the kill and more reliant on just having safe DPS throughout the fight. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we get further into the game, but let's talk about the early game as Tychus. The early game as Tychus, you want to really follow around your tank wherever your tank goes, and use your trait to follow up any of the targets that your tank goes in on. With someone like a Varian, his charge range is about the same, or your running gun's about half the range of his charge range. So wherever he charges in to taunt the target, you're probably still going to want to use your running gun to get close enough to where you can use your trait and take out that target. Then you're going to use your minigun, your overkill anyways, to get that extra damage, and you can throw your grenade while you're using your trait or while you're using your overkill without canceling either of them. So that is something that you will want to be able to do as well. But you'll see Azerite generally just likes to throw his grenade a little bit late to see if he can't secure the kill. So that's really all you're doing in the early game. You do also want to double soak where you can. You can double soak without melting point by simply alternating the targets that your overkill is singled out on, and then using your basic attacks to finish off the targets, or even just a grenade to finish off the targets. In this case, he just takes a step back, uses his grenade for some extra damage, and ends up using his overkill to secure one of these kills. Then at this point, he just steps away. BBJ gets a great cleanse, allowing his team to kind of take a step back and get in a better position. So you can still double soak without any major talents on Tychus, but you do have to use a lot of your resources to do so. So it's something that you will need to do unless your team has that. In this particular case, he's got an Abathur that can cover one lane, a Malthael that can double soak or handle camps. He doesn't really need to double soak. Instead, he just needs to follow around the Varian and do exactly this. Just throws his damage. Now, he ends up getting... I mean, this is just a really great play from the other team. They saw that their team was getting jumped on, and they counter-engaged. Now, as we approach level 7, there are a couple talents that you can take, and this is always a very debated talent here. Relentless Soldier's really powerful. A 30% damage reduction while you're stunned or rooted is pretty big. You're going to be stunned quite a bit when you're going against something like an ETC, and also you're going to get rooted potentially by the Stukov. Now, if you play well, you shouldn't get rooted or stunned, but there's sometimes that you just can't really answer that, and it's just bound to happen. Melting Point, on the other hand, is one of those interesting talents that it's one of those few talents in my cases where you can actually see the value of the talent. I can't tell you how many times I've been able to kill someone with the damage over time of my grenade. And so that's a reason that I swear by this talent. It's not a lot of damage, but it does really add up. If you look at your grenade, for example, it does 364 damage. So this effectively is increasing the damage of your grenade by about 27 or 28%, which is pretty big, seeing as your grenade's already a big chunk if you're just trying to take out someone's last 10-15% of their health. Since if you throw it against an assassin, it's about 12 to 15% of their health. If you're throwing it against a tank, maybe about 7 to 10% of their health. So to being able to increase that damage by about 30% is great. But again, this is one of those few talents where I honestly cannot tell you how many times I've thrown this grenade out, and they've just the last little bit of melting point has led to the kill. So I swear by this talent. I think it's a great talent. I've also been playing a lot of Tychus since he's gotten these talents. He's one of my favorite heroes right now, so I've been playing a lot of him. I love this talent, but I definitely understand where Relentless Soldier is very good in the competitive environment. Especially when you were the only major DPS for your team. As you can see in their team, they're running an Abathur instead of a second DPS. So they have a solo laner, a tank, a healer, and one DPS, and then a utility. And so when you've got a team comp like this, it sometimes is better to take some of the safer option. But again, Melting Point can be very strong for finishing off targets. It can also be great for speeding up a camp or speeding up wave clear. Every 10 seconds, your frag grenade is a one-shot on an entire wave. So your wave clear ends up getting really, really good, especially for the maps like Alterac Pass, where you might need to stall out an objective, walk up to a lane, throw one grenade, and then walk back to your team. And now the enemies need to deal with a wave, and all you did was throw in a single grenade that has 50% increased range. So it's a really powerful talent for those kind of stalemate maps where you're holding the point for a little bit, because you can quickly just throw a grenade and force the enemies to either lose an entire wave of soak or end up having to send one person to go deal with that wave. So you can see one grenade can take out a wave. I think Azerite could take a tad bit longer to make sure that he's got it aimed where it hits more of the minions, just because of how valuable the grenade is. But at the end of the day, he still gets a lot of value from it. And it's also a relatively low mana cost ability. 50 mana does a good amount of damage for that 50 mana, so it's pretty efficient to throw almost off cooldown if you need it. One of the things that Azerite does really well is if he sees anyone of his team on a camp, he'll throw his grenade out to speed up that camp really quick. You saw I did about the last 20% of that camp for his Malthael. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this at the beginning of a camp, because if you have like someone like a Jaina, you might knock them out of the Blizzard, and Blizzard's going to be worth more than your grenade. So try to make it closer to the end of camps where the melting point damage will finish up. But at the end of the day, Azerite plays safe, he focuses on double soaking, and he'll follow around his tank and lead to extra kills. He ends up taking Odin. Now, the thing to know about Tychus is that his single target damage is actually higher outside of Odin. Odin is good for a few reasons. When you know that you're going to be able to get more AoE damage, when you need to stay a lot further away because your standard range is something like, what, a 4? 4.5, and Odin's range is like 10 or something. So if you need a longer range. And the third thing is if you're ever sieging, and this is something that the Koreans do really, really well. I recently casted the Korean tournament, the largest Korean tournament, and they use Odin a lot just to siege. They almost take every team fight outside of Odin, and then when they end up winning a team fight or losing a team fight, they'll use it to siege or counter siege. And so that's one of the things that's really great about it. But in a fight like this, is a fight where everyone's kind of clustered, so he wants to get some value out of his minigun before he uses Odin. but it is a rather tricky situation. So instead, he's just going to throw Frag Grenade off cooldown to make sure that the enemy Stukov has something to heal. And so right here, ends up using his minigun, gets gusted, uses his dash to get away a little bit. He uses his W to interrupt the mosh pit, and then he quickly pops the Odin. Now he's just going to simply be doing AoE damage here, trying to get Hyde low enough to where the last rites finishes them off. And now he's just going to quickly take out June, and he's looking at taking out Kyocha. The extra damage and range allows him to zone out anyone, do a lot of AoE damage, and allows him to just keep safe, consistent damage throughout the fight. So as we start approaching level 13s, this is where, again, you have another set of debated talents. Generally, the build that I end up recommending for the competitive environment is Neosteel Coating, because then you don't get bursted down by something like a Boomerang and Mage build on a Falstad. Falstad jumps in, you pop Neosteel, and you laugh at Falstad, right? But there's two approaches. If you're going to be taking Titan Grenade, then you kind of have to take Neosteel or That's the Stuff. Both can be very good. Neosteel's great against burst, where That's the Stuff is a little bit better against more sustained damage. And then it allows you to take Titan Grenade at level 16 without feeling bad. If you want armor-piercing rounds, increasing the damage of your overkill, you kind of have to take the increased range, as well as increasing your movement, or sorry, decreasing the enemy's team's movement speed to get value out of armor-piercing rounds. And that's what he ends up going with here. He ends up taking the Q talents, and I think partly because they already have a finisher. They don't need Titan Grenade to finish off targets because they already have Last Rites that's going to finish off targets. So I think he's really depending on the coordination of his team, and I can definitely understand that. So he ends up going with Spray and Pray here. And this is definitely another possibility. I actually, right as they changed his Q talents, before they gave him Press the Advantage, I talked about the possibility of having a Q build, and I tried it for a little while, but I wasn't a huge fan of it, just because of the way you usually draft Tychus to blow up a single target, and I felt like Q build, there were just better options. But I can understand if your team is drafted correctly, it is definitely a really good possibility. So right here, he uses W to speed up the destruction of this fort, but all the enemies are missing, so they want to play relatively safe. They do have a full level on the opposing team, and they are just going to do their best to play it safe for now, just because they will be getting level 60 for the enemy. So early game, you're going to double soak, you're going to assist your team, you're going to follow up your tank, and that's about it. Mid game, you're going to look for team fights where you can quickly destroy a single hero. You can pop a hero with your burst damage from Bigger They Are, whatever your tank goes on, and then possibly pop Odin so that you can play safe until your trade is off cooldown. When you start reaching the late game, you're going to be needing to play a lot safer, looking for quick kills, and maybe saving your Odin to counter siege or to siege after objectives. And that is essentially the basics of what you're going to be wanting to do at the start, the middle, and the late portions of the game playing Tychus. Choose a talent. Level 16, he ends up going with the armor-piercing rounds instead of Titan Grenade. Again, I generally recommend Titan Grenade. It allows you to have kind of the full setup, follow-up for yourself. I mean, your team will taunt something, and you will have Bigger They Are to get them down to 30%. You'll have Overkill and Titan Grenade to finish them off. And that's usually what I recommend if you're going to need to... if you don't have the team comp that you want. But if you do need more sustained damage rather than burst, this is actually a pretty strong combo. And you can also take... can do this all day to make it even more sustained. But Big Red Button's also very valuable. It's a lot more siege damage, and it also allows your Odin to last much longer. So it's, what, 50% longer? Since it lasts, like, what, 23 seconds? You're like over 30 seconds. So as they're approaching this is kind of the area that you'll see a lot of Tychuses in Korea just immediately pop Odin. They've got the extra time to do it. I think what he's concerned about is Mosh Pit. So he wants to make sure that he's out of that so he can frag grenade the Mosh. Instead, he just dashes away, and he doesn't actually need to frag grenade the Mosh. So I think that is part of the reason why he didn't just immediately use Odin there. Now the next tribute's going to be spawning. He can use his frag grenade to dismount the enemies, but otherwise there's really not much he can say. So he ends up just getting to a safer position with his team, and they look to take a team fight over here. So at the start of this, he immediately uses minigun, gets a decent amount of damage off on the enemy heroes, but he's in kind of a rough position since they just got hit by a wailing arrow, so they're all silenced and they're all a little bit lower. They want to get topped off, so BBJ pops a trait, and they start going in. He immediately does about 30% of the Urel's health with his grenade as well as his overkill. And you can see that the overkill's hitting 3 to 4 people here because of that extra range at level 13. He knows that Mosh Pit's not up, so he's not too concerned about that. He wants to get in to do enough damage to where Last Rites leads to a kill. And so now that Last Rites has led to a kill, he's not concerned about Mosh Pit. He just wants to get as much damage off as possible. This person ends up getting hit by a Stukov root. That's not really too concerning for him. They end up just going for boss since they know that the enemy team cannot contest. They used a lot of ults, as well as they lost their Sylvanas, and they still have Taunt, Odin, as well as Brightwing's healing. So they're not too concerned about this. Brightwing ends up grabbing the trait since they don't really need any healing while they're doing the boss. He uses his W to speed up the boss, and you saw his W did about 10% of the boss's health. So it is definitely a very, very powerful talent. And just ability, because Melting Point does 300 damage to minions, mercs, monsters on top of the 500 damage it already does. The opposing team ends up grabbing a really good boss here, knowing that they were going to lose their boss, and so he does what he can to get some extra damage off with his overkill, and now he just goes back to trying to get a target low. So right here, he immediately stops shooting when the opposing ult goes out, and then you can see he's just getting a little bit of damage off, throws a quick grenade, and finishes off the target. And with that extra range, you can finish off a lot of targets, and that's the thing that really makes Tychus so good, is if everything's going to plan, your bigger they are is going to lead to a kill every single time that your tank lands a CC. But everything's not going to plan. Things like Odin and your grenade can still lead to a lot of kills that other heroes would have missed. So right here, he just uses Odin to siege. Again, outside of Odin, you actually do more single target damage. So sometimes it's better to just use Odin for things like this. Their team was able to get that tribute. They were able to get a lot of damage off on the structures. Just pretty straightforward. So as we're approaching level 20, again, I've talked that there are a couple different options that you can go. If you are going Titan Grenade in one of these two talents, you almost always go Big Red Button. If you do end up going into the Q build, you do have two options. It depends on how the fights are going. The lower cooldown and the permanent armor on your Q is great if you need to have those really sustained fights. Thinking something like can do this all day lowers the cooldown of overkill to, I believe, 7 seconds, as well as gives you just 40 armor while you're channeling it, so it allows you to just have that constant DPS going. It's definitely a good build if you're in a position like this where you don't have a lot of sustained damage, and if you're against like maybe a healer that can't keep up with that sustained damage, like maybe like an Uther or even like a white main, where if you can interrupt her W with your grenade, then you can pretty much just use overkill to out heal or to out damage her healing. So there are a lot of options like that. Now in this case, I think Fury goes in a tad early here. They're all stealthed, and Fury ends up going right in on a target that Azerite can't follow up. They do end up getting a lot of damage off still, and he is still able to get off a W and a Last Rite. So at the end of the day, it still ended up leading to a pretty good kill. I just think that Fury could have waited a second, but I guess in this level of competitive, you can't always wait. You don't always have that opportunity. And so now he ends up taking Big Red Button at level 20. What Big Red Button does allows your Odin to last a little bit longer, and your W is also going to fire a nuclear missile on top of the damage it normally does, and it's 700 extra damage. Now it takes a long time to land, so it's usually only a zoning tool and increased siege damage. You can see right there, it does the initial damage, and then it also drops a nuke. It's great for siege damage, but not so great for actual DPS. So right here, he's just playing safe, trying to zone out the enemies and trying to get some free siege damage where he can. That's generally all you do with Odin, is you just get as much siege damage as possible, and you kind of force the enemies to react to it. And in order to react to it, they have to push you really far out, which is very difficult because of your extreme range that you have while you have Odin going. So now he's just going to quickly throw out a W, getting him low enough for Last Rites to finish off the target. And he's just going to do his best to keep applying as much pressure as possible. That was a really, really strong minigun right there. Took Sylvanas down to the point where she had to use Bolt of the Storm to get out. And then an Ice Grenade to just get that extra damage off. Right here, he just does his overkill, throws a quick grenade, takes out the target, and that's it. So just to give you an idea, again, siege damage, topping siege damage on his team doesn't really keep up with Falstad, but there's only so much you can do. And as far as hero damage, he's topping hero damage for both teams. Even experience contributed, he's doing pretty good for his teams, especially with someone like an Abathur and a Malthael on his team. He's still able to keep up almost to the point that he's up to the Malthael in that experience contributed. Overall, he was able to be kind of everywhere, secure a lot of kills that his team wouldn't have gotten without him being there. And even some of the kills that Last Rites killed, he likely could have gotten many of those kills if he maybe changed the talent around, or if they just were given a little bit more time without that Last Rites going off. But he synergized the Last Rites really well with his Bigger They Are, as well as his Titan Grenade, and he worked really well to make sure that Malthael could secure those kills. In fact, of the 12 kills that they have on the enemy team, 10 of them were set up by him and or Malthael in some way, which was really, really nice to see that and how that played out. He participated in 11 of the kills that were done this game, and that is why the pros play Tychus. Generally, just to kind of sum it up, he's usually drafted to blow up any target that the tank will go on. Usually drafted with a Garrosh, but sometimes drafted with something like a Taunt variant. You use Bigger They Are to make it to where the enemy loses the majority of their health while they are taunted or stunned. And then right after that, you can just throw a grenade, usually finish up the target. So it allows you to run a blow up comp or a pick comp with only 2 heroes, a tank and a Tychus, and that's all that's required, which allows your team to kind of draft a little bit different. You can have a much more varied draft and kind of answer the things that the enemies bring, while only needing to draft 2 things to lead to kills for your team comp. So it's a really, really powerful combo and a really powerful hero that can fit in a lot of team comps, and it also allows a lot of variety in your team comps by drafting something like a Tychus. Great. In Storm League, Tychus is a pretty strong hero, but I will say without the coordination, things like Bigger They Are do lose a lot of value, because if you don't have someone who's going to be taunting the target near you, and you don't have someone who's going to be CCing, and you don't know when they're going to CC because you don't have that communication, you do lose a lot of value with a talent like this. I'd imagine in the higher ranks where you kind of can still read your tank to see when they're going in, Bigger They Are still an amazing talent. But I think in lower ranks where the focus is a little bit off, you could get away with the increased range and things like In the Rhythm. But at the end of the day, this is still essentially the build that I run. I do sometimes run the Q talents at 13 and 16, but I primarily just run Titan Grenade. And but this is something that I'll run. Usually when I run these, I will take the level 20 Q talent as well, because I just think it's good. But that is why the pros play Tychus. He's a great burst hero that has a decent amount of sustain if you end up needing it with something like Commandeer Odin. I do get asked a lot of times what I think about Laser, and I will be kind of honest. I'm not a huge fan of Laser, but I do see the purposes for it. Because Tychus' single target damage is higher when he is outside of Odin, it would make sense to drop down a Laser so you could stay with higher DPS and then just increase your DPS further by using something like the Laser Drill. I'd imagine it's pretty good on a map like Infernal, or not Infernal Shrines, Battlefield for Eternity, where you can increase your race potential by using your Laser Drill. I would just be a little cautious about taking it on a map like that, because it is a non-hero summonable unit. So something like Artanis can blow up your laser in a single W, which would feel really bad. You're dropping a long cooldown ability, and he's literally pressing a single 4-second cooldown ability to remove your ult from the game. So I would advise caution by picking a talent like that. Watch the enemy team, make sure it's something you can get value out of, and make sure it's on a map that if the enemies walk away, you still gain value. So I would say something like Battlefield of Eternity would get the most value out of it. If they walk too far away, your laser drill can just DPS the objective, and if they're close enough, then it can still DPS the enemy heroes. I wouldn't recommend it on Infernal Shrines, even though it kind of fits the same criteria I just mentioned, purely because Odin is so good on Infernal Shrines. But I would say Drill is definitely a possibility on maps like Battlefield. And Tychus is a decent hero on those maps as well, especially with the tanks that are usually drafted on that maps. I would avoid Tychus on maps where your tank's going to dive pretty far to start a fight. Things like Anubarak or May are heroes that I would probably recommend against with Tychus. Even something like a Murden, just because the Murden's not really guaranteed when he's going to land that stun, so it's hard to know when you can follow up the target. The heroes that I really like with this are ETC, Varian, and Garrosh. ETC can stun someone and bump them closer to your team, allowing you to quickly drop them with bigger they are. Varian can taunt a target that's close to your team and you can blow them up. And you also have Garrosh who can throw someone close to you, and then you can also blow them up. Drafting with a Tychus can really change his potential in a game. I think that he's decent in most drafts, but he's absolutely amazing in the drafts that can get a target close to him for about 2 seconds. And if anything can get a target close to him for about 2 seconds, he's in a really, really good spot. I also think that he's a little map specific just because of how Commandeer Odin works. It's a 100-second cooldown that gains more value in the fights that people can't really walk away from. But again, I don't think that he's bad on maps that you can't abuse that, because you can always just play him to his strengths and then just use Commandeer Odin for siege damage, which is what's very popular in Korea. So that is Tychus, particularly that is Azerite's Tychus, and thank you guys so much for watching, and feel free to check out my other videos.